Welcome back. So we are starting on Middle English now, and so this lecture will be a sort of introduction to some of the things we can expect throughout this time period. The next lecture will focus also on the social and political history before we start diving into the linguistic history found during this time period. But to start with a sort of just general timeline of some of the major events that happened during this time, Middle English is often seen to have begun as a result of the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest. So once the Normans took over England, this marks a very important time period, an important change in leadership, an important change in linguistic usage. So French was the language that started being used, and sort of English lost its power as a result of this. This lasted until the 1200s, so King John loses lands in Normandy, so there's not as much of a connection with the mainland any longer from that period of time. We'll see in the next lecture some more details around that. Some other important events that also helped lead to a lot of changes in the usage of English include the Hundred Years' War that happened in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Black Death or bubonic plague that happened that affected many of the people that were alive at the time. The use of Parliament in English, so when Parliament started using English as opposed to French, this changed, and English became an official language of legal proceedings. And then the end periods of Middle English, there's usually two separate dates that are often given. The first one, the introduction of the printing press in England, where things could start being written, things could start being standardized. This was known as a very big change and a very important linguistic influence. French is no longer used in Parliament anymore just shortly after this, so English is the only language used in Parliament by 1489. And then in the early 1500s, when Henry VIII ascends the throne, this is the other date that's often given as the sort of end of Middle English. So that last bit of time, those last 20 or 30 years in the late 1400s and early 1500s is sort of the end period of Middle English. But as we'll notice, a lot of these dates are giving us sort of general guidelines that sort of transition us into thinking about these periods, but that things aren't just sort of cut and dry with these particular dates. What a lot of the focus in Middle English will switch to, and what we'll notice as we're looking through different texts in Middle English, is that Middle English was known as the Age of Dialects. And this is something that, while Middle English was seen to have begun around 1100, ended around 1500, this is considered the Age of Dialects because this is a time of wild change and a lot of lack of standardization. So during the Old English period, there's a little bit of standardization. By the early modern period, we see a lot more standardization. We didn't really see that during the Middle English period. So this is considered the Age of Dialect because this is in some ways a period of wild difference, but also wild change, and it serves sort of as a buffer period between the very clearly Germanic Old English forms and what we see in early modern English and modern English, the more recognizable English forms. The structural changes were very distinct. They were very heavily influenced by French. We'll see examples of that throughout our experience looking at Middle English. And this is also the period of time where English becomes a little bit more familiar. We can look at it and we can usually understand most of what's being said when we're looking at Middle English examples, as opposed to those Old English examples that featured a lot of lexicon that we don't have anymore, a lot of structures we don't have anymore, a lot of case endings that we don't have anymore. So we can compare just looking at Middle English versus Old English, where the Chaucer example, how fares they fair daughter and thy wife, and John also, how no, what do ye hear? Chaucer's, that's something that looks very similar to present day English. It's something that would be relatively easy to decipher. We can get a pretty good gist of what's happening. But if we look at an Old English passage, Thawanda heongeon tutham chunga, God yeshelp us toi egen and toi eren. We probably would need to have some sort of dictionary, some sort of translator to know some of these words. We can't interpret that as easily. So we're starting to see a lot more similarities to present-day English in the Middle English time period. And in addition to these linguistic similarities, we're also much more familiar with the content that comes out of Middle English. So if you've taken English classes, you've probably heard of or read various examples of things like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which was during the Middle English period, the Canterbury Tales, which come out during the Middle English period. Most of our Christmas carols and a lot of our hymns are coming from this period of time as well. So even though some of those sound somewhat archaic in some ways, we can still understand them, and they're still much more familiar to us. During this transition of time, it's important to remember that there's certain dates that we use to distinguish things like Middle English from Old English, Middle English from Early Modern English, the next period after that. But there wasn't any sort of drastic break. There's no such thing in language. Language is gradually changing, it's constantly changing, and there's not really a way to say like, oh, this sudden thing happened and now all of a sudden we're in Middle English. This is something that is a gradual transition throughout time. And there's way too many components to the English language to try to expect everything to change at the same time anyway. We have over 36 different sounds. We have several thousand different possible syntactic constructions. At the time, there were tens of thousands of words. Now we have hundreds of thousands of words as we've continued borrowing different words. So a dramatic shift would make language incomprehensible. These are things that happen very slowly and very continuously over time. So the texts that we would find from the 11th and 12th centuries would be a big transition between Old English and Middle English, and these would look very, very different than the texts that we would have in later Middle English as well. So we'll see, depending on the timing of where these texts are coming from and depending on where these texts are coming from, a lot of variation during this period of time. One of the things that leads to this being the age of dialect, so much difference in all of these texts, is that during Old English, there was the late West Saxon dialect, and this was sort of given as a kind of standardized written form of Old English due to all the work that Alfred the Great had done to sort of unify the country and sort of create one general sort of focal point for where things are happening, where education is taking place. People still spoke very diverse dialects, but a lot of the writing was more stable in Old English. So we had one particular dialect that most of the writing was taking place in, even though people did still speak in various ways. But that stability falls drastically during the Middle English period because we no longer have any sort of sense of standardization. So these regional dialects that have always been diverse in English throughout the time that we've had, Middle English will show this a little bit better in diversity in the literature itself than any other time period because of this lack of standardization, because there wasn't a sort of form that was expected to be used during this time. And this lack of uniformity was partly just because of the effects of the Norman invasion, the effects of French taking over as the language of the elite. So after the Norman conquest, that West Saxon dialect lost its prestige. It became just one of many regional dialects as opposed to the central one that most things were written in. And this can explain why a lot of the written texts in Middle English are so diverse. We're not looking to one particular dialect for how we're writing things, how we're putting things on paper. And authors during this time period would have written primarily in the dialects of their region. So even when we compare different texts from the same text from different places throughout the British Isles, we'll notice a lot of variation between them because they're written in the way that people spoke and they're written in the way that they were used to locally. Scribes during this time were most likely to write in their regional dialects rather than some sort of commonly accepted norm, mostly because there wasn't a commonly accepted norm during this time. And the scribes would have represented close to what the spoken word of the time was. They would have written about how they spoke because there was no standardization. So we can see in the text during this time period a lot of the changes in language that had occurred and at the end of the Old English period, but that aren't reflected in the Old English literature because of that standardization that we saw in the West Saxon dialect. Standardization is something that tends to prevent linguistic transparency in the written form, especially with respect to language change. So if we think about our spelling system today that's been codified for over 500 years, there haven't been a lot of spelling or grammatical conventions that have changed drastically. We'll see some examples later in the semester. But for the most part, our spelling is relatively similar to how it was in the 14 and 1500s. And so even though dialects have diverged, even though pronunciations have diverged, this isn't really represented in the written form of present-day English in the way that it would have been during Middle English. And so if we look at the diversity that we see in the kinds of texts in the literature during this time, it's going to give us a lot of information about the linguistic diversity of this time. Chaucer was known to have complained about this, talking about the great diversity in English and in the writing of our tongue. And this is something that you can expect to have been natural amongst any group of people that are speaking a language for a good deal of time. By this point, English had been spoken for several hundred years after separating from other Germanic languages. But because of this lack of standardization, this creates problems for communicating between different groups of people that are speaking the language. It creates problems for the sense of unity that might be found when there are standardized forms of a language. There's also some other issues with how we determine the kinds of dialect variation we see during this time period. Most of the time, we're thinking about dialect variation at one single moment in time, so things like regional dialects are going to be very important. But there's several different ways that we can classify these regional dialects during this time because there was so much variation that was found. So, most of the time, the simplest way to distinguish this would be the northern dialects, the southern dialects, and the midland dialects that are found sort of in the middle portion of what is now present day England. There's also a useful distinguishing between Western and Eastern dialects during this time, especially in the Midlands dialects. So you'll notice that the sort of Northern, Southern, Western, Eastern are just general sort of groupings that we have with how we discuss dialects during this period of time. And typically, when we see these, we want to refer to what sort of features set apart a dialect. How do we know that something belongs to a particular dialect? And in sociolinguistics, what we're typically looking for are different features that we would refer to as isoglosses, sort of things that we can put on a map that says on this side of the line, people are more likely to speak this way. On the other side of the line, people are more likely to speak this other way. And generally, what we're looking for is a bundle of these different features, these different isoglosses that are mapped together that say that there's a lot of features on this side of the line that are all used in this area. On the other side, a lot of these features change, and that gives us more evidence of a clear dialect boundary. One of the clearest ones in the United States today would be between Southern English and other areas of English. There's a lot of different dialect distinctions that happen in the relatively same place that gives us a pretty clear idea of where Southern English tends to be spoken, even within the variation that we find within those areas. But there were a couple of different complicating factors during Middle English. There really weren't any clearly marked off dialect features. We can't find just a nice clean bundle of isoglosses that say on this side of the line everyone spoke this way, on this side of the line people spoke this way. We don't really see this bundle of features patterning in any way that suggests a very clear or strong dialect boundary. People were interacting with people nearby, and so there was mixture that wasn't easily categorized in ways that we would typically think of putting dialect boundaries today. So instead, what we're seeing is a system of a lot of overlapping distribution of different features. So when we start looking at different dialects, when we start talking about features, there are going to be sort of general features that you're likely to see, but that you're not necessarily always going to see with particular regions. So we're thinking of these as broadly characteristic of a place, not something that's categorical, not something that you would expect to always find. So if there's a particular spelling of a word that we often see in a region, it doesn't mean that we're always going to see it that way. There may be variations that aren't as common, but that are still very easily found. And we'll see some features that are helping to distinguish some of the things between Middle English and Old English as we're looking through these. So some of the main features that we'll start seeing through the rest of the lectures for this unit is that Middle English has a much simpler inflectional system. There's an increased reliance on word order and syntax during this time, so there was a lot more flexibility in Old English. We'll see that flexibility fade away very quickly as we lose our different inflectional endings. There's also an increasingly diverse vocabulary. There's lots of loanwords during this time because of the influence of French. And so there's a lot of diversity during this period that's not just based on the regional variation, but based on a lot of these other features as well, a lot of these linguistic changes that are affecting certain areas at some times and other areas at different times. So we'll see this diversity not only between the Middle English period and the later Middle English period, where over 250 years you can expect a lot of changes to happen that can influence and change the language. So when we're looking at something like 12th and 13th century poetry, this would appear very archaic to a 14th century author. Change was happening relatively quickly because there wasn't standardization. If we look at something today from 250 years ago, we're looking at things like the founding documents of the United States. There is some difference in the way that those are written, but it's not as drastically different as what we would have seen during the Middle English time period in the same span of time, because there has been standardization since then. When we're looking at these different texts to sort of tease apart when things are happening, where things are happening, spelling is going to give us some clues for this. So because spelling was not standardized, the way that people wrote was things that they sort of decided amongst themselves based on how they heard themselves saying things, how they spoke, and the different regional sort of things that they would have come up with for how to represent that. There were some beginning attempts to reform spelling during this time, however. Orm is probably our first spelling reformer. He wrote the Ormulum during this period of time. He was from the East Midlands, a monk during the 1200s. And what he was intending to do was to write homilies from the gospel to be read in church throughout the year. So he was writing things that were largely religiously based texts during this time. And his table of contents showed that he intended to write over 200 of these, but only about an eighth of the ones that he intended to write have survived. So he may have written more that we just don't have, but if he had written all of them, we would have had a corpus of well over 250,000 words, over 10,000 lines. We only have about an eighth of that survives today, but it's still a very large text that we'll be looking at pieces of throughout this unit as we can see some examples of what's happening during Middle English. He was committed to making these sort of spelling reforms and trying to create more consistent spelling representative of certain kinds of sounds. And so we'll see some examples of this throughout the unit as we're looking at his texts. Probably the most striking innovation was marking short vowels with a double consonant. This is something that we do still use today in some cases in English. So this gives us the distinction between hoping and hopping, for instance. So we have the long vowel, the O sound versus the ah sound in hopping. And this is something that even though some of the vowel qualities have changed since Middle English, the general pattern of this happening is something that we do still see in our spelling today in some areas. Some of the other variation we're going to see has to deal with when things were written, not only where they were written. So if we're looking at just a text, if we don't know the date and we don't know the region, this can be hard to determine both the date and the region because of the way that things tended to move through the British Isles as different changes were taking place. So if we look at the example of the word stone, which in Old English would have been stan, and then Middle English moved to stone, it would have been stan in the 12th century in the East Midlands, as we see this as stan in the early 13th century in the West Midlands. By the mid 13th century, we're seeing stone in the Midlands areas as well, so we're seeing some of those changes take place. Stone was spelled stone with 2 O's by Chaucer, so this is starting to become the norm by Chaucer's time and starts spreading to some of the other areas around the Midlands. And it's really only in the far north and in Scotland that you still see stan by the late 14th century. So while it's starting to change in the 13th century in the Midlands, it would have taken another several decades to 100 years for that change to start happening further north. So the trend that we're seeing with the word stone and with a lot of other dialect features as well is that these tended to spread from the south to the north. So the south, this is where London is. This is where the older areas of the centralization of English was. This is where the head of government is. This is where a lot of that influence is going to begin. And then it's going to move north over time. So it would have spread from south to north during the 13th century. So if we find it in isolation, just finding stone doesn't necessarily help with dating a dialect because it could be from the 12th century Southern form, it could be from a 13th century Midlands form, or it could be from a 14th century Northern form. So we usually want to think about where and when these were written to get a little bit better idea of the kinds of dialects that we're seeing. And to sort of sum up and just give an idea of the general distinctions that are being made, why we're separating these general areas of England into the areas that we are, if we compare a map of the major features of Old English, we're looking mostly at these major kingdom areas. So Anglian in the north area, with Northumbrian and Mercian, and then we had the West Saxon dialect that was in the southern areas and Kentish in the far southeast. And these end up somewhat corresponding to some of these more broad regional dialects that we see in Middle English. So the northern one is close-ish to that Northumbrian area. The Mercian one split into the East and the West Midlands dialects areas. And then we have the southwestern and southeastern areas that sort of correspond to West Saxon and Kentish, though not exactly. So we're seeing a little bit of difference and a little bit of distinction in how these are being broken up compared to what we would have seen during the Old English time period. So southwestern would have continued the West Saxon, southeastern would have continued the Kentish, East Midlands and West Midlands, part of the Mercian area, and the northern areas remain those areas that are just generally north of the Humber River. So in the next lecture, we'll look at more of the social and political aspects of this time period before the other lectures start diving into the linguistic changes. As always, if there are questions, email me, schedule some office hours, bring your questions to class, and we'll talk through them together.